I'll get in this question that was posed to the panel earlier this week on one of my other shows and live streams. There was at one point an Ohio State Georgia series that was canceled that has since, I believe, been re-signed. But the comment was made in the live chat. Why did Ohio State and Georgia cancel? And also the comment was made that Ohio State never plays top 10 non-conference opponents, which of course is ridiculous. They're playing Oregon this year, a top 5 team from last year. The Oklahoma series home and away 2016 and 17 was against the Sooner team that finished in the top 10 both seasons. But in regards to the Ohio State Georgia situation, do you have any background on that, Steve?
There was a series set up between the two of them, and I think it got canceled during a brief stretch where the Big Ten had gone through and had talked about enacting some kind of an annual situation with the Pac-12 where they would rotate games against Pac-12 opponents. I think cooler heads prevailed with that, and so they kind of tried to extricate themselves from some of those entanglements. There was a contract, I believe, and I'm not sure the exact years that it would have been played, but Ohio State and Georgia were supposed to play. And I think the Big Ten asked all of its it was like a 1 or 2 year window when Jim Delaney got this wild idea that, why don't we replicate the Big Ten ACC basketball challenge with their partner in the Rose Bowl, the Pac-12, and it just never took shape, and I think that is, from a logistics standpoint, probably the better thing. I think for schools here in the Midwest, it's better off that trips to the West Coast are a little bit more sporadic than every other year or something like that. I think that's just maybe asking a little bit too much of the fan base. And, the teams, it's great to go to the West Coast once or twice a decade, but I wouldn't want to be on the hook to doing that on any kind of a regular basis. So I think that was what the impetus was. It was an idea that they came up with, and they said, hey, let's clear some dates down the line. And I think that got caught up in the wash in that. I think it is notable, as you said, that Ohio State does in fact play challenging non-conference opponents. We can debate whether Notre Dame and Texas are challenging enough, both top 15 most years, top 10. I mean, Notre Dame was a playoff team a few years ago and played for the national championship back in 2012. Kelly is probably the best coach they've had there, back to Lou Holtz, it seems to me. So Texas, Notre Dame are on the upcoming docket. They're playing Oregon home and home this year and next year. Washington, I believe, is on the docket as well down the line. They've been a playoff team in recent years as well, though they had the coaching change there right now that they're going through. And in the recent past, they've had home and homes with Oklahoma, Virginia Tech, Miami of Florida, as well as USC in the past decade, Washington earlier in that decade as well. So I don't look at it as a case where Ohio State is ducking anybody. You and I were talking off the air. If you took there's 14 schools in the Big Ten. If you took the other 13 schools and removed them from the equation and then stacked up the rest of the country 1 to 120 in winning percentage, championships, or any other way you want to look at it, I think Ohio State's non-conference opponents would be, 5 of the top 10 over the last 20 years, and over the next 10 years, you would have played 5 of the top 10, whatever that list looks like. I think especially you're talking about Oklahoma, I mean, they're in the playoff every year. I think what we have an issue with is everyone is clamoring to see Big Ten, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan in particular, and maybe 1 or 2 others, Wisconsin. They played LSU, I think, with a one-off type situation at Lambeau Field, is to get some SEC opponents on the schedule. And the SEC schools, some of them play an ACC school as like a natural rival, like South Carolina plays Clemson, Florida plays Florida State, Georgia plays Georgia Tech. So they don't necessarily go out of their way to go look for, another marquee non-conference game. Some do and some don't, and then some of them play those one-off games in Atlanta and Arlington as well on varying degrees. Ohio State does have Georgia scheduled. I think it's 20, 30, and 31, which sounds like something way off in the distance, but when you think about it, it's 2020. It's only 10 years from now, and typically that's the window. You schedule 8 to 10 years out, and Ohio State's done a great job filling up its dance card, I think, for the upcoming years. They even have a Boston College series in there as well, and they're actually playing them, I think, one of the years the same year they're playing Texas. So one year they will have Texas and Boston College in addition to 9 Big Ten games as it stands right now. And just one other thought that I look at in terms of scheduling. This came up, I want to say, in my chat last week or sometime recently about the schools that I would like to see Ohio State schedule. And I quickly went through a list by conference. And I said from the ACC, I'd like to see Florida State, Miami, for recruiting purposes to get down there to the state of Florida. And even from the American, I made an exception for Central Florida, maybe play the 2-1 or something like that with them, just to get down there to Orlando. And no, Orlando may not be as big a stomping grounds for the recruits as Miami, but maybe that's a thought too. Then kind of coming up the coast, I mean, obviously, if you could get Clemson on the schedule, that would be great. A clash of the Titans, unlike anything we've ever seen, certainly, because those two teams are going to be in the top 5 theoretically for the next 10 years, it looks like, as long as Sweeney is at Clemson and Ryan Day is running Ohio State. Pittsburgh is kind of a geographical rival, and it would be an easy trip. Same thing for Louisville. Maybe you stack a game against Pittsburgh or Louisville, as they're doing with Boston College, in a year when you also play Washington or an Oregon or something like that, one home and one away, that type of thing, and kind of bolster your schedule that way. Maybe playing one that's a little further down the line, as those two schools are, and not Clemson, but still an attractive game. Virginia, I kind of mentioned them. They have never really done much with Virginia. North Carolina is one that they played years and years ago. I don't know that they've played North Carolina since Archie Griffin was a freshman back in 1972. That would be kind of a fun one. The rest of that league, I don't have much of a clamor to play anybody else in the ACC. Not Wake Forest, not Duke, etc. NC State, been there and done that. They don't really kind of make your socks go up and down playing NC State. And I'll just quickly touch on a couple of the others, because I don't want to talk for 30 minutes about scheduling. But SEC, Alabama, Auburn, LSU, those 3. Texas A&M would be awesome. 4 on the other side, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee. There was talk they were going to play Tennessee at one point, and that may have been scheduled as well and fell through one way or the other. But there's 7 pretty good ones there. The rest of them, not real excited to play. Mississippi State, Vanderbilt. I would say Kentucky would be on that list, but Kentucky could be one like Pittsburgh and Louisville that you stack in a season when you're also playing at Texas, something like that, since they're more of a top 30, 40 program than a perennial top 20 program. So, and again, they played Kentucky, but it was way back in like the 1920s or something. I mean, it's been a very long time. And you got to tip your hat. I mean, Stoops is an Ohio guy, and what he's done at Kentucky has been phenomenal. So it would be kind of a neat thing, I think, if they would play them. From the Big 12, they played Texas, they played Oklahoma. Who really brings you value out of that conference? I don't have a clamor to see Ohio State.
TCU.
Yeah, they played TCU in the one-off game. I don't really. If Baylor's going to be a perennial top 10 team, I'd say perhaps. I don't know that people are excited about going to Waco, Texas. But perhaps I don't really. West Virginia is a notable in the Big 12. I would say they've played them sporadically through the years. I think probably 3 or 4 times in my lifetime. I was at West Virginia in 1998 for the season opening game. Number 1 Ohio State went down there and beat West Virginia. Bolger was the quarterback. It was 34-17 was the game. It was a great game. Great atmosphere at West Virginia. I've been back there for a game or two with some friends who are West Virginia alums, and we've had a great time down there. So I would put that on a list of home and home teams that I'd want to play. So we've covered 3 of the leagues right there. And then the 4th one is the Pac-12. Obviously playing Washington and Oregon. The only other ones in that league that I would even consider would be Stanford, USC, and UCLA. The rest of them, you don't get much benefit out of playing Arizona, Arizona State, Utah. They played Cal. I don't think there was much gained by that. It was what it was. And Oregon State, they played them here in a one-off guarantee game a couple years ago. Jonathan Smith made his debut as the coach there, and they blew them out. So, again, not much value. No desire to go to Washington State. I've tried and find that on a map. It is clear to the Idaho border, Mark. You can't even – how do you get there? Do you take a covered wagon from Seattle to get to Pullman? I'm confused how you even try to get to Washington State. So that's my upshot. I came up with a solid list, I thought, of about 15 who they haven't played recently or ever at all that would be good to add to the schedule. And, Ohio State, they've got nobody to apologize to about their scheduling.
Not at all, especially this year in 2025 coming up, as you mentioned, some of those double up opportunities against the Power 5. But it's one thing to play 2 Power 5s. It's another thing to stack it up against Texas and Washington in 2025. A few other notes just to complement what you had to say. I recall a couple games against Washington State, and Drew Bledsoe actually won game in the early 90s against Bledsoe in Columbus. And then Earl Bruce's first team played Washington State as well. You mentioned that SEC ACC series that Florida State, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Louisville, Clemson, South Carolina. Kentucky would be the one team out of that, based on my scheduling knowledge, that doesn't seem to go out and play anybody else. Georgia, Florida, they typically go out and try to schedule other teams, South Carolina as well. Yeah, the SEC and the ACC, and playing those Atlanta games in particular, so they always tie up another game. So you've got a lot of Auburn, Clemson type of matchups. We've seen Alabama take on Virginia Tech and others out of the ACC, Duke and Louisville the last 2 years in Atlanta. Remember that in addition to the Lambeau Field game with Wisconsin and LSU, that 2 years prior, Wisconsin came down to the South and played LSU in Houston, and both were really close, entertaining games. The last time I can recall, Steve, the SEC and the Big Ten, at least prominent teams in the SEC and the Big Ten, because I do recall an Indiana-Missouri series about 5 years ago, back and forth, when Indiana was the near the bottom of the Big Ten. They actually beat the Eastern Division champion Missouri team about 5 years ago. But Alabama Penn State played a home and home right near the end of Joe Paterno's stay in Happy Valley, and Alabama took care of them pretty well. Didn't slaughter them, but beat them by 2 and 3 scores at a home and home, and that was a rare trip for Alabama to come north and take on a Big Ten team. Yeah,
that was a great series too, and a lot of excitement surrounding that, particularly the game at Penn State. I know to have Alabama coming in there. Again, I think it's going to take, and we're seeing Alabama kind of, they added one, I think, a home and home with Arizona, I think, if that sounds right, recently. And we're starting to see, somebody wrote that Florida hasn't played a non-conference true road game outside the state of Florida in,
I mentioned that a couple
years or something.
1991 at Syracuse.
91 at Syracuse. And I know Georgia had not played one either out of the state of Georgia until they went out. And I think they played Arizona State a few years ago. Does that sound right?
They went to Notre Dame 2 years ago.
Went to Notre Dame now. Yeah.
Yep.
that's good, certainly. And obviously Ohio State's going to play Georgia, and I that's one, you mark down and you put a star by it, because that's going to be a lot of fun when that day comes. And if there's a way to make a marquee game in this day and age, with everybody's games are on TV, that would be one for sure, and probably the top non-conference game in that given season. I think we all live for the biggest and best matchups, and Oregon is going into this season's game with a new quarterback, and having to retool a little bit on their offensive line, a little bit on defense. So this may not be a vintage Oregon team, but they're still being picked. I picked up two of the major magazines this week, Street and Smith's and Athlon Sports, and they're in the top 10 in both. So, I guess we'll see on game day what kind of a team Oregon's going to have. I think they open up with North Dakota State before they play Ohio State. So that'll be interesting to see how they're matched up against a great FCS opponent to start out, and then have Ohio State coming in. So, again, these marquee matchups, and for them to have Notre Dame on the schedule coming up. Gene Smith played it at Notre Dame, and so I think for him that was an important one for him to get on the schedule before he retires. He's probably moving toward his last 5 years as the athletic director at Ohio State. No sign of slowing down yet, but he's been on the job at Ohio State since 2005, a 15-year run so far for him. So he's done some big things there. And so I think to have Notre Dame on the schedule in a few years is going to be just fine, in another great marquee matchup. They played them in 95 and 96 home and home. Have played them in bowl games twice since then, both at the Fiesta Bowl. Ohio State won both. And Ohio State, after losing the first two matchups to Notre Dame in 1935 and 1936, Ohio State won the two in the 90s and the two bowl games, and now in just the last 25 years has gone from 0-2 to 4-2 all time against Notre Dame. And you brought up Washington State. They were a guarantee game, by game opponent in 2002, the national championship season. Jason Gesser was the quarterback. Yes. And Ohio State won the game at Ohio Stadium 25-7, I believe was the final score. And very entertaining game and a competitive game with Ohio State kind of pulling away late in that championship season.
I overlooked that one, but remember it well. Yes, 25-7. Jason Gesser and that Washington State team went to the Rose Bowl and played Oklahoma that year. So they played a really good Washington State team, not a marquee name in college football, but a really good Washington State team, and the last decent Washington State team that we saw until Mike Leach got there. Well, and check out Steve's book, because he outlines all this stuff in regards to various national championship seasons, and obviously his work down through the years at Bucknuts. But Steve, you know better than I do, but this is an interesting topic. If you go back to that 02 season, it's one of the more intriguing, interesting, quirky schedules that Ohio State ever played. They had never played 13 games in a regular season before. And we hear teams and coaches and fan bases complain about bye weeks now. And, oh, our team had to play 6 consecutive weeks. We needed a bye here. And so that team played 13 consecutive weeks. And you mentioned the Washington State game, but they also played a very difficult non-conference game against both Cincinnati and Texas Tech that year. That schedule was loaded.
Yeah. Back when they used to have those exempted games, the Kickoff Classic and the Pigskin Classic, you could sporadically play those. And Ohio State, from, I want to say, about 94 until they got rid of them in about the mid-2000s, when they finally went to a full 12-game schedule. I think 2006 was the first season that everybody nationally had a 12-game schedule going forward. I think prior to that, it was sporadic, depending on the number of Saturdays between Labor Day and Thanksgiving. If there was an extra Saturday in there, you could play a 12-game schedule. But the other years, like 2005, was just an 11-game schedule because there weren't enough Saturdays in that period. And so what was going on was the NCAA had rules about those exempted games that you could only appear in each one once every 4 or 5 years or whatever. and Ohio State took full advantage of that. They were in every one of those they could sign up for. Home, neutral site. They played Boston College they played Fresno State in the 94 Pigskin Classic, Boston College in the 95
whatever it was called in New Jersey.
Kickoff Classic.
Yeah.
97, they invented one called the Eddie Robinson Classic, and they played in Wyoming. 99, they're back in the Kickoff Classic in New Jersey. They lose to Miami in a game that time is pretty well forgotten, and for good reason. Ohio State lost like 23-12, and 99 was a miserable 6-6 season anyway. But and then after that, they played that Pigskin Classic in 02 against Texas Tech. I think it was the Pigskin Classic.
What was odd about that, Steve, is that it was at home.
Yeah. By that point, it was no longer a neutral site game. I think they figured it was easier to sell tickets if it's part of one team's season ticket package as opposed to a one-off in California or wherever. And so that was how that came about. And so they also played Alabama in the Kickoff Classic in my freshman year at Ohio State in 1986. Lost the game 17-10. I think Ray Perkins may have been the coach at Alabama then. And Chris Carter and Chris Spielman were on the team. And in 1986 for Ohio State, they lost. And then after that season, they went out to Washington and lost 40-7. So in 1986, they were 0-2, which was my freshman year at Ohio State, for the first time in college football since 1896, a span of whatever 90 years it had been since Ohio State had opened a season 0-2, and it just happened to be my freshman year. Thankfully for them, they won the next 9 games and played Michigan for the Rose Bowl in the last game of the season, but lost. So.
Yeah, you would have thought that would have turned out to be a miserable season. Those first 2 losses in that trip out to rainy Seattle, losing 40-7. There was a blocked punt early in the game. And I'm sure you recall, Steve, then they came back to Columbus and scuffled and scraped their way by a mediocre Colorado team 13-10 the next week after that. So they were on razor's edge to go to 0-3, and then they turned out to be really good, and it was an extremely talented team that came a decision on 4th and 5 or a missed field goal, however you want to look at it, from beating Michigan and going to the Rose Bowl as the outright Big Ten winner.
Yep, one of those tough losses to Michigan that Ohio State experienced in the 80s and 90s, and that became the norm rather than the exception during that 15-year period. But obviously they've done a 180 where that's been concerned here of late, and Michigan now considered looking straight up at Ohio State in this Eastern Division.